Hi, Steve.
Hi, Serena.
Welcome.
How are you?
Hi. I'm good. Welcome to our Engo channel. So, Steve, you are obviously a world-renowned polyglot. I've seen your videos many times on YouTube. And I wanted to know exactly how many languages do you speak currently? Because I feel like that number is kind of changing.
You know, it's a difficult question because let's say that there are 12 languages that I can speak now, more or less comfortably. But then there's languages like Czech and Romanian and Greek, which I learned before going there. And then when I was in those countries, I was able to use those languages, but now I haven't used them. So I would have to refresh for a day or so. And right now I'm learning Arabic and Persian. And I mean, I listen to podcasts from Al Jazeera, which I understand, just listening I understand 20-30%, but then I work through them, reading the transcripts, and so it's all a process of learning. So any language, I mean, you can always improve. So it's just a matter, you know, you're always improving, and then you don't use them for a while, they get worse, and then you work at them again and they get better. So it's all in a state of flux. But the total number, let's say, is 20.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm sure, like, when did this sort of language learning journey start for you?
Okay, so probably when I was like 17, living in Montreal. Even though Montreal's a bilingual city, in those days was very much divided, English and French. And we had French at school, and we didn't learn, we couldn't speak. And then I got very interested in French, and of course the key thing in language learning is motivation. Once you're motivated, nobody can hold you back. Once I was motivated, I started watching movies, I started reading the newspaper. I ended up going to France, where I took my university training, 3 years in France. I used to hitchhike in Spain. And then in 1968, working for the Canadian government, I was sent to Hong Kong to learn Mandarin Chinese because Canada was getting ready to recognize the People's Republic of China. Then we lived in Japan for 9 years, so I had to learn Japanese. And then I did a lot of business in Europe and Germany and Sweden. And so I just learned languages through my professional career. I decided, well, why don't I learn Russian? Why don't I learn Korean? Why don't I learn Portuguese? Why don't I learn, Arabic? So in the last 12 years, I've been particularly interested in learning languages, more as a hobby, whereas earlier it was more because I needed them for my work.
So you talk about how motivation is really important in learning a language, and you said that's really what got you into learning languages in the beginning.
Right.
What really, like, is motivation something very, very specific for you, or what is it exactly, or what was it?
Well, so it started with French. So something about the culture has to appeal to you. So there are many people who learn Korean because of K-pop or because of Korean drama. So there has to be something that or you have a friend, a girlfriend, boyfriend, partner. Something has to motivate you. And once you're motivated, then of course you're anxious to consume more and more of the language and start using it and stuff. But it starts with motivation.
Okay, can you tell us some methods for language learning that have really worked for you? Because there really is now there's so much information online, and people are approaching language very differently from before.
I think that I'm a great believer in the idea that you don't have the language in you. So the language has to come from outside. So input is tremendously important. You have to listen a lot. You have to give the brain a chance to get used to the language. You cannot explain the language to the brain. The brain doesn't understand. The brain won't understand any grammatical explanations about something that the brain hasn't yet experienced. So and the brain is a machine that creates patterns. That's what the brain does. It's set up to do that. You have to feed the brain lots of input. So listening and reading. You just have to listen and build up your vocabulary and build up your familiarity with the language.
Many parents are keen on, teaching their kids English, and there are so many English academies. A lot of kids, have tutors as well. What do you think is sort of your biggest frustration with these traditional techniques of learning a language?
Everything is oriented towards the test. And then they buy lists of words. You know, if I learn the 5,000 words that I need for IELTS or for TOEIC, then I'll do well. Whereas in fact, to do well on TOEIC or IELTS, actually you need to elevate the overall level of your English. So that if you hear something, you immediately know what it means. If you read something, you read through it once, you know what it means. If you see a sentence, you know if it's correct or not correct. So you have developed this natural feel for the language. So there's too much of an emphasis on testing and not enough emphasis on learning through content, through interesting content. And the other thing the testing does, it destroys any motivation that the learner might have had. When you try to study a list, every time you look at that list, you're learning less. In other words, block learning stuff is bad for the brain. The brain likes some repetition, but it also likes novelty. That way the brain gradually accumulates experience and starts to, remember these words. But if you sit there, you might remember that list for tomorrow morning, but next week it's all gone,
So it really is like, it is a balance. And I think when you are, planning to do a test or to take a test, you have to think about, why is it that I want to pass this test? Why is it that I want to do a good job on this test? And like you said, I think, you said, don't focus so much on getting something right, I guess, but more so on the overall, understanding of a language. Okay, let's talk about some methods of learning a language that you highly recommend.
Okay, Link is it's a website, and we also have apps on Android and iOS. And what it is, so we have 37 languages, hundreds, thousands of content items, always audio with text. Cannot have just text, audio and text. And when you listen to it, so I start my day, I make breakfast, I listen to Arabic. When I listen, there's lots I don't understand, then I want to read it. So you need to have both, audio and text. When you get the text, any word you don't understand, you look it up. You can save that word. You can save phrases to a database. And then Link starts to create statistics. How many words you know, how many words you've learned, how many words you've saved. You start to see that more and more words become known to you. And then gradually you move towards more difficult content, such as these podcasts from Al Jazeera in Arabic. So for the longest time, I was only doing our simple mini stories, but now I'm able to do podcasts on politics from Al Jazeera. So Link takes you from simple stories, lots of beginner material, and in most languages, including Korean, there's lots of beginner material available. The difficulty is to get to sort of intermediate and advanced material, which is usually more interesting. But to make that accessible so that you can actually be enjoying what you're reading and listening to while at the same time improving your language skills.
When you're reading something, how do you know that it's not too difficult for you and not too easy for you? What's a good way to gauge that?
Well, to me, the biggest thing is vocabulary. 10%, 15% new words, I think is a good area. There you're looking up words, and plus you have a lot of words that you have met before, but you don't yet know. The bigger thing is your level of interest. If you are very interested in the subject, you'll happily work your way through more difficult material. If the material is boring for you, then it doesn't matter how easy it is, But I think the biggest measurement is the vocabulary. You need words.
Yeah.
Words are key.
Very, very true. And Steve, while you've been learning these 20 languages, I'm sure you've felt like certain languages were easier to learn than others. Maybe they had similarities with English or French or whatever more languages that you're comfortable with. What do you think is the difference between like English and Korean, for example? And what do you think would be some challenges for learners of English in Korea?
Okay, so obviously, as you say, if the language is close to a language you already know, that obviously makes it easier. So, having the language be similar to a language you know is a big factor. I think a person learning English has a lot of advantages over a person learning Korean, say an English speaker learning Korean. and that is that there is so much content available on the internet in English. Limitless. At every level, both in terms of teaching materials and in terms of, sitcoms and stuff. But I've kind of gone at Korean 2 or 3 times. I kind of assumed, because I speak Chinese and Japanese, Korean should be easy. In fact, Korean is not easy. But one of the bigger problems was in those days, and I'm going back now 15 years when I was doing Korean. I went for like 6 months working on my Korean. And all I had was these textbooks, and the textbooks are extremely boring. And there was nothing interesting, and the genuinely interesting stuff was too difficult. Today, if I were learning Korean, I would do much better. In those days, I kind of gave up because I was bored with the beginner material that was just too either childish or uninteresting. A big issue, I think, in terms of difficulty is how much content of interest. How many things can you find that you genuinely enjoy, where you enjoy the subject matter, you enjoy the voice, you enjoy listening, reading, watching, and then can you use that as learning material? So where that situation exists, then the learning is easier.
Yeah. And do you think also knowing the culture or getting to know the culture also helps with learning the language as well?
I see it, and this is, again, getting back to the situation of a Korean person learning English. The two go hand in hand. So there has to be something that motivates you. And if a person is interested in K-pop, that doesn't mean that they're interested in everything in Korean culture. They're interested in this one little thing. But if they get interested in that, then they might find out about other things so that their interest might grow. I think the language is an introduction to the culture. It's not like, before learning Korean, I was so interested in Korean culture. No. But as you start getting into it, then you start to find things that are of interest. The same is true of a Korean person learning English. They have to find something that they find interesting. If they're just learning it for TOEIC, that's not enough to get them across the finish line. So it might be a movie, it might be a friend, it might be music, it might be a writer, current events, cooking, anything. But so I think the two go hand in hand. That inevitably, as you learn the language, if you're going to be successful, you're going to be discovering the culture and finding some things in the culture that really appeal to you.
What about for our younger audience, for kids? What do you think is important when it comes to learning a language? Because for them, I think it's very different than adults learning language because they are very much like a sponge, right? They just take in everything,
right.
And it's so much easier for them than it is for us.
In some ways, it's easier. In some ways, adults have an advantage. The adult has the advantage that they have more life experience. They have more vocabulary in their own language. So, no child is going to listen to podcasts from Al Jazeera on the relationship between, Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So we have interests as adults, and we have life experience, and we have vocabulary in our own language. If kids have friends that speak whatever language, they're just going to communicate. They'll figure it out, and they'll do fine. If the kid lives in Korea and wants to learn English, or conversely lives here and wants to learn Korean, it's a little more difficult if they don't have the opportunity to be with children who speak that language. So I think that, to me, the key is to make it fun for the kids, not to force them, not to put pressure on them, not make it an obligation, because you can easily turn kids off. And also, if the kid, I always feel if the kid doesn't want to learn English but wants to learn Chinese or is more interested in Spanish, give the children the freedom to explore, watch cartoons in Spanish, cartoons in Chinese, see what they like. So to me, it's all a matter of exposing children to hopefully interesting things in the language without putting any pressure on them.
Korean parents, they feel like there's a certain age where you have to approach phonics, a certain age where you have to approach, grammar rules and so on. What do you think are the most important skills when you want skills to develop when you're learning any language, even English?
There's no point at which you have to learn the sounds or you have to learn certain aspects of grammar. No. You just need to be exposed to the language and let them enjoy the language. Don't ask them questions on the language. Don't give them comprehension tests. Don't force them to do drills. Just let them try and enjoy the language. And very often, movies or cartoons can be good. Music, songs can be good. And without any pressure. And there is certainly no rules as to when. I was basically monolingual at age 17. So I learned most of my languages as an adult. Certain things will click in early, certain things click in later. It takes a long time. That's why tests are such a bad idea, because some things that you haven't noticed certain things, you haven't noticed certain patterns, and until you have enough exposure, you aren't going to notice those patterns. You aren't going to do them properly. And so you just have to wait for it. And in the meantime, just keep exposing yourself to the language. There's far too much pressure in language instruction, and it's counterproductive.
So it really does seem like, even whether it be for adults or for kids, your approach is really more input is better.
Absolutely. That's how you learn. Mm-hmm. You don't have the language in you. And when you do speak, you want it to be a meaningful exchange. So I definitely believe in input, and I don't believe in forcing output, and I don't believe... And corrections, you don't need to correct. You sometimes hear people say, well, corrections are so important because even in the child's, native language, the mother corrects the child. That's not true. The child doesn't learn from the mother. The child learns from his or her friends. Otherwise, children of immigrants in Canada would never learn English. They don't learn the language from their parents. They don't get corrected by their parents. They learn the language from kids at school. So, and they learn because they figure it out. After a while, they say it wrong, and then they start to hear it a few times, and then they figure it out. Most of the corrections we do ourselves. Just let people hear the language, use the language. Most of the time they figure it out. Nothing wrong with being corrected, but if you're having a meaningful conversation, you don't need to be corrected all the time. You just need to communicate. Forgetting, making mistakes, all of that. If you aren't doing that, you're not learning. There is nobody who looks something up in the dictionary and remembers. That person doesn't exist. And there's no one who gets corrected and then gets it right the next time. When I have my online sessions with my tutor at Link, the tutor will create a list of, say, 15 words and phrases that I used that I had trouble with, my mistakes. And I save these as lessons because they record them for me. And then I can go back 6 months and see what I did week after week after week. I make the same mistake every week. But gradually, slowly, I stop making that mistake. But it's a very slow process. Because it's habits. It's not some kind of theoretical understanding. It's like the third person singular in English. I'm sure everyone in Korea knows that it goes, I go, you go, he goes. So the third person singular of the present tense takes an S. Which is pretty easy compared to, say, Spanish. Yet, how many people say he go? Lots. They understand the theory, but they haven't got that habit yet. And that they have to get the habit. And the habit it comes very gradually. And so you have to be patient as a language learner. Of course it is. Because every negative thought, you don't like the language, you don't like the teacher, you don't like the book, everything, or you feel frustrated. You were, you went out and people were talking in English and you didn't understand, or you tried to say something and you kept on getting it wrong. If you focus on the things that you can't do, that's bad. Whenever you have a sense that you did something well, it was difficult, but you achieved it, that creates these very positive, endorphins or whatever, dopamine in your brain. And so, you've got to be realistic, manage your expectations. And if you went out, say, I'm learning Korean, and I went out with a group of Koreans and I struggled to speak, but at the end of it, I say, wow, I spent 3 hours there. I did communicate. I made a lot of mistakes. There were times when I tuned out, I couldn't understand what they were saying, but overall, like 6 months ago, I couldn't say anything. And now I can say something. And so it's very important to be kind to yourself in learning language and not to get frustrated.
That was so informative, and I'm really happy that we covered those big things because I think that's really important. Oftentimes people just kind of just study and think that they'll improve, but I think it's really important to think about mindset, your motivation. Why do you want to learn this language, right? Yeah. Thank you so much, Steve.
Okay, I enjoyed
and
it. Okay.
Be sure to stay safe and. Yeah, thank you so much for spending time with me today and giving us so many tips on language learning and learning English.
Okay, well, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.